what will be an impressive summation of an equally impressive honors thesis. Mr. Lawson's interest in the peculiar topic of the American-led liberal hegemonic order began, at least 18 months ago, if not longer? Over that period, he's thrown himself into literature with typical Lawson-esque gusto and has managed to identify in the process important gaps in that literature that demand significant interrogation. His theoretical approach, a rationalist game theoretical orientation, challenges the dominant explanations in the field. And it is on this score that I'm most impressed and parenthetically somewhat proud. It has been a pleasure watching him work through these many important questions pertaining to American statecraft, the origins and growth of international institutions and alliances, and ultimately rendering fascinating judgments about the durability of liberal hegemony. Without any further delay, I am privileged to call to the podium Calvin Lawson to present his Institute Honors Thesis, American Hegemony, Game Theory and Cost-Benefit Analysis of the Liberal International Order. Sorry, it's the International Order. I threw in the liberal one just to needle you.
All right, I want to start, you guys can read the title. So I want to start by saying a few thank yous. Obviously, thank you to Colonel Backich. Spent a lot of office hours, a lot of time also. Spent a lot of time sending probably irrational and very kind of weird emails at the middle of the night when I got an idea and I would kind of type it in randomly and see if it made any sense. And he always responded, even if it was a Saturday or Sunday morning, so I really appreciated that. Also, Colonel Basu, I'm an IS major, so you really helped me plug those gaps with the game theory and economics and make sure I'm not going to sound like a fool when talking about the game theory side of this, hopefully. My roommates, I have 2 IS roommates and an ECE roommate. My ECE roommate should probably get a minor in IS after listening to me talk about this for the last 2 years. And also to the hotel company Rats. That month you guys got me suspended from Stoop. I got a lot of work done. So I owe you some for that. So the way I got the idea of this research was I was studying in London at the London School of Economics after 3rd class year, and I'm sitting in this class. This class was International Political Economics, and in a very European manner, the professor, and not that I disagree, but he was going on about how the U.S., especially in the WTO, World Trade Organization, kind of built a system that allows it to defect when it wants to, break the rules of the agreement, while most countries within the organization are too small or not powerful enough to do the same, almost in a binding way where the U.S. and some other countries or groups can break the rules while the others are held accountable. And it kind of got me thinking, why rationally do people put up with this? The U.S. built a lot of these institutions in a way, led to the construction of these institutions in a way that it benefits the most, and it can basically cheat when it wants to and break the rules when it wants to. Rationally, why are people continuing to cooperate? In terms of game theory, someone defects, probably going to defect back. So I set about doing my research, trying to figure out rationally both why the United States at the end of World War II seemingly limited its hegemonic power, because at the time it was the most powerful state left standing, and at the same time why states continue to cooperate at the end of throughout this years and years of the U.S. kind of picking and choosing when it wants to play the game of the institutions it created. So just a quick overview of where I'm going to take you. I only have about 30 minutes, which is the long side of that. I'm admittedly long-winded with my speaking, so I can't go into all 3 games and all the case studies I've done. So I'm rather going to quickly take you through games 1 and 2, which those are my 2 outlets to explain why states entered into the institutions, explain their entrance. And game 3 is where I'm going to spend most of my time, and that's going into why the durability of it and why people continue to play, continue to cooperate and remain in the institutions. Finally, I'll offer a conclusion on what this means in terms of the durability as a whole of the institution. So to start, I got to go into rational choice. And when I started this, I had no set definition or set person I was following, but started with the GATT, or the WTO, and the dispute settlement mechanism. That worked. Eventually, I worked my way all the way back to the Bretton Woods Conference 45, and started there. And through that research, I came across Duncan Snedall's theory of rational choice, definition of rational choice, and it really echoed what Colonel Masu was teaching me in our economics class, which is essentially actors have preferences, and of those preferences, they can rank order them. They're going to choose the highest preference, or the highest preference while factoring in the perception of what they assume the other actors are going to do, and the restraints that come along with it. Most importantly, this really pertains to realist scholars who talk about rationality as a security seeking. So most states, people say, are security seeking, put that first. And I don't doubt that, but this definition of rational choice states that it does not require that this is their number one preference, or this is their sole preference, but it likely is, or at least one of the most important ones. So just a background, just getting into, before I get into game one. I took this from Brooks and Woolforth's book, America Abroad, and when they defined America's grand strategy. At the end of World War II, obviously, Europe was in pretty bad shape, and the U.S. Less standing, kind of as the most powerful state. There are people that say the Soviet Union are rival, but you can't really, overall, it's not really true until they become nuclear peers later on down the road. So as a whole, the U.S. was kind of less standing, and they had an idea of how are we going to rebuild our most important allies while also increasing our personal interest. And they define it as deep engagement, which is the U.S.'s grand strategy. And if you read through this, which you probably have, basically says they were going to try to reduce near and long-term threats to security, maximize domestic prosperity through a global economy, and sustain necessary cooperation. I argue that it is not necessarily solely security, solely economic gain that is the U.S.'s primary preference, but is the grand strategy of deep engagement that is the U.S.'s primary preference, and it includes all of these three factors. When dealing with this, I had to try to figure out a way how to model this. This idea of a dominant actor making offers essentially to create these institutions to very much weaker actors at the time. And I came across the Ultimatum Game. And the Ultimatum Game is pretty simple, about as simple as game theory comes. And it basically goes, there are two players and an assigned sum of money. One player is assigned the proposer and one is assigned the responder. So the proposer is the only person that can make an offer. And he can make an offer and split it as any way that he chooses. However, if the responder rejects the offer, then neither of them get any of the money. Therefore, the responder or the proposer is incentivized to make an offer that is going to be accepted. And now in this game, this kind of views it in a purely the responder's pure payoff maximizing. And in this case, because the proposer knows that the responder should rationally accept either of the two, because 1 is greater than 0 and 50 is greater than 0. He knows that responder's action is always going to be accept the offer. Therefore, you're going to have a Nash equilibrium of 99 and 1. However, research on Ultimatum Game, especially studies done at colleges throughout the U.S. have shown that this doesn't actually happen. And the reason is because responders tend to actually prefer 0 over an unfair offer, 0 over taking an unfair offer. So I had to introduce a new factor, which is, I call it C, but it's really just any cost that contradicts the unfair offer. So by accepting that unfair offer, I might bear other costs. And I say this could be like personal pride, or if you're a state leader taking an unfair offer on the international stage, what's that going to do to your domestic image? Costs like this, and those are going to factor in. Therefore, if C is greater than 1, now basically the unfair offer is 99 for the proposer and 1 minus C for the responder. If C is greater than 1, then that becomes a negative offer, and the responder would rationally choose reject over accept if it's an unfair offer. Knowing that he's going to reject the unfair offer, the proposer now must offer a fair offer in order to get any offer at all. So based off these two models, I say that there are 2 ways in which a proposer can get his offer accepted. He can either make a fair offer, and assuming that the person he's offering to doesn't have so much costs for associating with that offer, that he's going to accept it. The other, and probably the more important, is that the only way a proposer can expect to get an unfair offer accepted is to ensure that the unfair payoff for the responder is greater than whatever that cost is. Again, I don't have time to go into all the case studies, but I basically break down the institutions that we initially created, that the U.S. initially kind of pushed the creation of, and break it into NATO, the Marshall Plan, specifically the security gains, and the Security Council of the UN as fair offers is shown by the Ultimatum Game, whereas the World Bank, IMF, GATT, and the General Assembly are unfair offers in the sense that although they might have one equal vote, or everyone can kind of choose how much say they have by how much they contribute, the U.S. design them in a way that the U.S. could always kind of dominate the system if they choose to. So this explains basically why you have people initially join, right? But how you can't explain why. So for example, the GATT only had about 23 states initially join, which is the GATT is the prelude to the WTO. UN had about 50, but it doesn't explain why over the next 50, 60 years, numerous countries, almost all the world started to join these institutions. So the Ultimatum Game didn't take me to the next step. I had to address an answer. So I basically come across the idea is, if C, I basically make the point that C prevented states from initially joining the institution. That the idea of those alternative costs, especially if you think you're not a Western European state or you're not a democratic state, you probably bear a lot of costs by accepting, especially domestically, by accepting offers made by the U.S. and the West. So I say that C prevented them from initially joining under the model of the Ultimatum Game. So I have to pose the question, if C prevented states from joining initially, why did it not a few years later? And I came across, this led me to the learned behavior model. And ignore a lot of the numbers are really arbitrary, just to prove a point. Learned behavior model argues that when multiple players are engaging in a continuous game, they will, quote, follow the history of how others play, how others have played in the past, and choose a strategy for the future that is a best response to the passive players. I.e., depending on the playoffs or the payoffs for the 2 actors in each game, they're going to learn to play over time that payoff or that action. For example, let's say there's a population. Within that population, there's a proportion of alliance builders and there's a proportion of free riders. The alliance builders use alliances to increase their overall military strength. The other half of the population, the free riders, depend on the collective strength of the alliance builders to protect themselves without paying the cost of alliance building. Both cultures randomly interact throughout this game, and based on the payoffs, you're going to expect that over time they're going to shift towards everyone becoming free riders or alliance builders. So this is a payoff scheme that I found, and it basically, the way the payoff scheme works, if the population of alliance builders is greater than, if the population of the alliance builders is greater than 2/3, 66% of the population, which is right here, once you cross this threshold, the entire population arguably will learn to become alliance builders. So now let's say we slightly increase the payoffs for alliance builders. So now I've increased the payoff for alliance builders to 10 and 10 from 8 and 8. What this does is when you look at the payout schemes now, the necessary population for alliance builders for the entire population to shift to becoming alliance builders is 57%. So just slightly increasing the payoffs reduces the necessary population in this game by almost 10%. So in this when I'm writing in my research, I argue that in this section that after the initial years, so in the initial years when they were founding the payoffs weren't real, they weren't concrete, they were all proposed payoffs initially, the Ultimatum Game. However, once those institutions became started, those payoffs became real, they became concrete and observable from the outside countries. So as these payoffs became more concrete, the payoff for becoming an alliance builder increases. At the same time, citing Stephen Brooks' work, Producing Security, I argue that the payoff for being a free rider in the system decreased, as he argues the globalization of production basically reduces the payoff and the incentivization to be a free rider. Therefore, on both ends, the relative payoff for becoming an alliance builder in the international order, specifically from the 1955 to 1990 range, increased drastically. And just to give you an idea of how these institutions increased over the decades, the GATS started with 23, by 64 it had almost doubled, and by 97 it was 102. Currently it's at 164. Same, very similar numbers to the IMF. NATO, I'm going to get into NATO because it's weird, but essentially I argue that the Eastern European countries, the EEC countries, they, over time during the Cold War, learned to become alliance builders. However, it wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed that they were allowed to act on that. And I'll get into that further when I get into the third game. So basically I argue that these two, the Ultimatum Game and the Learned Behavior Model, take us to and explain how people and states entered into the international order. Then I need to address why they actually stay. And so I started with the DSM, the Dispute Settlement Mechanism, which basically acts as a high court for the WTO. And I built a model based off that, but looking at it, so from 1995 to 2015, you can see, the U.S. defected or had complaints brought against them in the DSM over 124 times. The entirety of the EU is in the 80s. China's in the 30s, and those are the three highest. So the U.S. is the only country with over 100 times being brought against the DSM. Then you look at a lot of the smaller countries, they've never defected in their entire history. Based on that, I built this model that I'll get into in the next slide, and I take the rationality and try to look at other institutions. You know, the invasion of Iraq is a perfect example of the U.S. seeking permission, or seeking permission under the UN, which was rejected, and then we invaded Iraq. The Law of the Sea, which we basically wrote and then didn't sign. How we basically redefined the mission of NATO following the Cold War is a perfect example of defection. So I basically asked, how can states rationally choose to remain in the international order? And I'm going to go through three case studies. I'm going to go through the U.S. steel tariffs of 2002, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the U.S. redefining NATO to highlight this point. So normally I call this the asymmetrical sequential game. And normally you've got the first actor moving, he either chooses to cooperate or defect. The second actor can either choose to retaliate or do nothing. However, I argue that the dispute settlement mechanism, which acts as a court in the court within the WTO, allows you a third option, which is file a complaint if they do defect while still continuing to cooperate within the system. In this model, I choose South Korea because they're a relatively important trade partner, and we have less of an incentive to defect against them than maybe some smaller countries. But again, these numbers are arbitrary, just to highlight the point that if the U.S. perceives that the payoff for cooperating before it does really anything is greater than the payoff for defecting, they're going to cooperate. At the same time, based on that, if the United States perceives that the payoff for defecting is greater, so defecting and then paying the cost under the dispute settlement mechanism, which is usually in the form of rebalancing tariffs allowed by the other country, then they're going to do it. Then they're going to defect, which they have 124 times. Thirdly, I have to also be able to explain why other countries don't defect. And obviously some do, as I talked earlier, but I chose Honduras for these last two because Honduras is not a key trade partner for the US. They also have never once had a complaint filed against them in the WTO. And just to highlight why they can't defect in this system, knowing that the US will rationally always choose to file a complaint, if Honduras were to defect, they're going to the repercussions are significantly more important than vice versa. Mainly because Honduras is allowed to apply equal tariffs back, equal rebalancing tariffs on the U.S. It's going to be a drop in the bucket in the U.S. economy. However, American tariffs on Honduran goods, high American tariffs on Honduran goods would send shockwaves to their economy. And the idea is that these small countries really can't defect under the DSM, whereas countries like the U.S. can. The U.S. also does complain a lot in the system. 37 times between 2000 and 2016, 15 of these were against China, 6 were against the EU. So then I take this and I try to apply it. First, I take it to a WTO example. And 2002, we applied steel tariffs, essentially on all imports of steel, because Bush was trying to prop up the steel industry. Obviously, people were not happy, especially the EU, Japan, Korea, China, and all those other countries. That was in March 2002. It wasn't until November 2003 that the DSM ruled U.S. tariffs were in violation of the regulations. They basically ruled that these countries were able to apply rebalancing tariffs on December 15th if the United States did not remove it by then. So the U.S. removed them 10 days before that date, experienced no costs, and enjoyed 21 months of tariffs on the steel imports. And I don't want this doesn't exactly highlight the model in the sense that they got a payoff back from the DSM, but what it does show is that normally under rationality, when the U.S. put those tariffs up, those countries would have, and without the WTO, they would have applied equal tariffs, starting a trade war on steel imports. But because of the way the DSM was set up, they were able to complain within the DSM, retaliate within the WTO, while still cooperating in the long run without having to engage in a trade war. And that's their payoff, is not having the cost of that. I take it and apply it to a pre-WTO case where there is no dispute settlement mechanism. And so the Agricultural Adjustment Act was a law that was passed in 1993, but Congress amended it in 55. And in that amendment, they required that they basically required that the president seek to prevent any costs on U.S. agricultural goods from imports, i.e. tariffs on agricultural imports to prop up the agriculture industry. And so the U.S. basically sought permanent exemption from these GATT regulations on agricultural goods. Most states, just about every state, had vocally said they disagreed with the nature of the exemption. However, from a vote to 23 to 5, they supported it. And I think these quotes from the Greek delegate at the time and the Australian kind of really highlight what I'm trying to point at, is that the Greek delegate specifically says that it contradicted it, but they supported it in a political spirit. And the Australian representative said that they supported it in order to send a message to Congress that the world looked to the U.S. for effective economic leadership in the free world. The idea is that the long-term payoffs for these institutions via cooperation far outweighed the short-term rational decision to to defect back or do the same thing that the U.S. was doing. I had to get into NATO. NATO presented the biggest challenge to my research because it's a lot different than most of the other institutions. It's selective and it's not open to everyone. So I argued through the learned behavior model that the EEC countries learn to become alliance builders. However, the problem was the EU countries, several of the EU countries, specifically France, didn't want the EEC countries to enter into NATO after they already rejected them from the EU previously. The only difference was that the U.S. did want the Eastern European countries in NATO. So they basically rewrote the mission of the NATO because previously NATO was specifically designed to counter Soviet advances in Western Europe through collective security. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there goes your main mission. So the U.S. shifted the mission of NATO to be one that was indefinite and long-term, providing long-term security for Europe and the United States. Just basically reshifted the payoffs for being in NATO as a whole. But changing the mission of an institution is probably the greatest form of defection that you can do. And they all stayed, even though some questioned the necessity of NATO and some didn't want the Eastern European countries in there. They all stayed because the long-term payoffs of being in NATO far outweighed the short-term, kind of unilateral decision from the U.S. to both welcome these countries in and change the overall mission of NATO. This is a quick overview of the games, the institutions, and where I kind of do my case studies in each of these three games. Because it's confusing. Just kind of so you can see it. And I have more that I couldn't get into at the time, but just thought that'd be nice for you guys to see. My conclusions on the durability of the system. And I know I kind of broke the rules of keeping your writing short, but I felt it was necessary. So I write that the crutch of these game theory models is that the offer to join and remain in the hegemonic international order produced such large net payoffs that no country could rationally choose to leave the system because of long-term cooperation. It pays the most security and economic dividends. However, payoffs do change, especially based off of the United States and other powerful actors' decisions. As long as I argue that based off this, so long as the United States does not defect or reduce the payoff cooperating, so much so that the cost of cooperation is greater than the payoff of the international order produces, then the international order will continue to exist as it is. Can't expand much more. Most importantly, I say that the vastness and interconnectedness of the international system, which is really centralized around U.S. leadership, makes it so that no members can credibly wish for the downfall of the United States within the system without wishing for their own downfall as well. Unless they leave the order, which itself is, as I've explained, is a bad decision. And this plays in the idea that there are countries that are rising, and China challenging Russia. But if you're a part of the if you're a part of WTO, you can't credibly wish for the U.S. economy to tank without wanting your own economy to tank. And that's kind of part of the system is this expanding global economy is the idea that that in itself is security providing, that we build a system in which people depend on our success. That concludes these are some of the works I referenced. That concludes the presentation part. I'd like to open up to some questions. I know I talked too long, but any questions? I guess I started.